Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles. I'm on summer break right now, and I've been able to have some really cool conversations, read some really cool books. And my guest today is a political scientist. He's a professor at Kentucky State University, which is an HBCU. He is focused on the empirical testing of political claims. And the book that I just finished last week was called Hate Crime Hoax, and it's about hate crime hoaxes. So you might be familiar with like Jussie Smollett. And when that all happened, I was like, oh, well, that must be an isolated case. Not really the case that it's isolated. But Wilfred Reilly, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to expose you to people who aren't familiar with your work. I'm really excited to expose your work and you to them. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, genuinely glad to come on. Always down to talk.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't really know exactly how to get into it because I wrote down some notes and stuff like that. But I guess just starting, like, can you just bring us into why did you choose to go down the academia path? Like, what in your background said, hey, I'm going to look at data. Data is going to be my contribution to making the world a better place, which is, I assuming, what everyone wants to do with their lives, make their impact on the world. And you're having one, and you're choosing to look at data, which is kind of classically boring, I guess, right? I mean, I don't know, like sifting through all that data that you do. Can you just bring us into like your past, how you got into this, why you chose academia, why you chose this specifically?
Well, my past is pretty diverse, actually. Like, my mom was an inner city school teacher. So I grew up mostly in the fairly hood neighborhoods where she taught. Like, I was born on the south side of Chicago. I pretty rapidly, without like claiming that area too hard, I moved to the pre-gentrification north side. I lived in Wicker Park. Moved to the east side of nearby Aurora, which is Illinois' second largest city. And mom was either a sub or a teacher in all these schools. And I was intelligent. My mom actually is from sort of an upper class family background. She quarreled with her family for a variety of silly reasons. Started to talk to them again, at least hopefully. But I mean, But I mean, just a working class kid in these areas. I was an athlete for Aurora East, although honestly, my best sport was middle distance running, and just was a regular guy. And I ended up, because I did do pretty well in the standardized test, and I'm a big fan of standardized testing. I don't think that anyone would have looked at me as a 17-year-old kid with my skateboard and seen, well, this is clearly someone that's, focused on joining the upper class, or this is someone who gets particularly good grades, because I didn't. I just actually took the math and verbal SAT and ACT, did extremely well. And I wasn't absolutely terrible physically, and I wasn't a criminal. So I got a couple of the local state universities offered, and I ended up going to Southern Illinois. And all this is in the Midwest. And through there, I got kind of that baseline middle to upper middle class education. I also had a lot of fun because SIU at that time was one of the country's top 20 or so party schools. So it was an interesting place to go to. It's down in kind of the more relaxed southern tip of the state in a small city called Carbondale. But after that, I mean, for a variety of reasons, I mean, affirmative action probably helped to some small extent, but I'd done quite well in undergrad. And I was beginning to develop an interest in kind of broadening my horizon. So I went to law school at the University of Illinois. And then I went on to get a PhD at Southern Illinois again. And when you ask what made me choose academia, I almost didn't. I worked while I was getting the PhD because I really don't like ramen noodles all that much. So I had a bunch of these just weird ass city kid jobs. Like, first I was a freedom rider for the Human Rights Campaign. I'm still very pro gay rights, but just to kind of dish on left activism for a little bit. This is actually one of the things that moved me a little toward the center right. Like, I'm not radical today. When you actually work with sort of these, ideologically beautiful groups, Planned Parenthood, you see how things operate, you become a little more skeptical. But large charities like the Human Rights Campaign for Gay Rights, so on down the line, Environment America, retain a specific group that we'll call People for the Social Interest to actually run their campaign. So you take these people who are mostly college age, often athletes, and essentially either send them on buses around the country to fundraise, often in hostile areas. For, say, gay rights, you might go to Tennessee, or you'll just post up in a major city. Like, we had an office on the south side of Chicago, and you'll ask people like, hey, got a minute for gay marriage and love? And obviously this job involves a lot of fighting. It involves a lot of, that's not obviously the goal. It's not all often physical, But I mean, it involves a lot of argument, a lot of office relationships, let's say politely, so on. So I did that for a couple of years. It was a lot of fun. And I got tired of people trying to hit me. So I worked in that sort of financial sales and trading floor sector for quite a while. I worked on LaSalle Street. I worked in the international headquarters for Marcus Evans, the kind of British company known for its aggressive office culture. So their little boiler room environment there for a bit. I actually recommend it to young guys and women, in fact. But you know, that went on for a couple of years. And I actually, by the end of my period in bullpens, was making enough money that some of these companies that I was working for asked me just to stay on as a sales director or something like that. And by this point, I had pretty much completed the PhD. And I was also kind of done with the young jackass phase of my life. Like the freedom riding and sales were what they were in one of the world's like 5 or 6 cities. It was very enjoyable. But I wanted to do some good. I wanted to put some of the learning to use. I'd been one of those guys who was in grad school for actually 7 or 8 years because I was taking care of a sick relative back home. So, I mean, I was taking 1 or 2 classes online or something like that per semester. I was teaching in the local community college system to keep my hand in, which was itself pretty interesting. I mean, that's like Malcolm X and some of those famous, you know, poor urban serving schools. I mostly taught at Harry Truman. But by the time I was done with this, I didn't want to be an inner city teacher myself. The boiler room environment was kind of getting tired. And I got these offers from some fairly good, interesting schools. Like Kentucky State, where I teach, is a historically black college in Appalachia. So it's about 50-50 urban African-American and working class rural white. I figured I actually might get a chance to help kids. So I came down here. I've been quite happy since. I mean, it's a state university. Like, unless you get to one of the 40 Ivy jobs in a year, that's kind of what you want to do if you have a PhD. Well, there's nothing wrong with teaching in community college or anything like that. But I mean, I've enjoyed it. Oh, and why do I look at data? Because if you teach in college and you don't publish, you get fired. So I figured that I may as well look at things that I was interested in and what I actually found. And this gets into what's in my sort of Amazon and Goodreads and so on biography, which I meant quite sincerely. This brought me to my interest in empirical testing of kind of political claims. And what I mean by that is, of course, there's a place for the higher end, purely data-based research. At the next Midwest Political Science Association conference, I have a paper prepared on what predicts conflict in Africa. Certainly that has to be looked at. But what you see in society very often is these claims that are made at like the upper middle brow level of discourse. Like there's a lot of white privilege with class never being adjusted for some reason that are really influential, but that seem to never be tested. Believe all women would be an example of this. White privilege is a major problem as an example of this. Cultural appropriation is possible as an example of this. Let's swing to the right for a little bit though. Like diverse societies don't work. The world is 6,000 years old is too easy. I won't even use that as a pinata, but just there are all of these claims that people say all of the time in modern upper middle class life that no one seems to really look at using modern quantitative methods. And one of the things I actually teach at Kentucky State is quantitative methods, methods 301. So I started, in addition to academic work, in addition to, you know, I still do some investing and I'll do some consulting on the side. But in addition to that, I started writing high-end popular press material that would look at some of these claims. And you mentioned the first book, and break in at any point, by the way, because I tend to ramble. But like, it's fairly coherent, but it can get annoying. I've heard from exes and friends at bars and so on. So it all makes sense, but I obviously want to hear your questions. The first ones are very on point. But I mean, the first book, Hate Crime Hoax, I had become curious years ago about how many of these high-profile racial incidents were real. And I want to specify right off the bat, no one denies that if you claim a sexual assault or if you're a white guy, you say you were beaten up after closing time at a tough Hispanic club or vice versa, of course. No one really denies that probably happened. But you keep seeing these incidents. There's no other way to put this. Tawana Brawley, Duke Lacrosse, Air Force Academy more recently, Covington Catholic, Erica Thomas, this congresswoman says she was almost physically assaulted in a high-end store. Jussie Smollett, of course, Juicy Smollett. You know, you could really just go on with this. Drake University, Goucher College. Remember the University of Missouri? Like, that wasn't all disproven, but when they were saying if faculty leaders were hitting students with cars and there were swastikas and human crap painted in bathrooms, like you were seeing all of these cases, and in every incident, the large majority of the story, let's say, turned out not to be real. I mean, at Missouri at one point, the student body president claimed that the Ku Klux Klan had been spotted on campus and that he was in touch with a general about how to deal with the problem. This is one of the most widely reported elements of that story. And it turned out to be fake. He just made it up. The U.S. military actually confirmed, like, no, we do not liaise with student leaders. If we ever have to launch a battle plan on a university campus, just faded into the ether, as so many of these do. But for the book Hate Crime Hoax, I looked over a period of only about 5 years. And I mean, there are many people on the other side that will still point out the majority of hate crimes happen, so on, sure. But over a period of about 5 years, I was able to put together, concentrated in this period, I was able to put together about 500 of these cases, which became the book. And they were all very high profile cases. One of the cutoffs for inclusion in the book was reliable national or regional reporting in the media. So less than a tenth of the hate crimes in the period that I investigated were nationally or regionally reported. I mean, I had a very skilled research associate working on this. I worked on it. I'm not bad. There are only about 7,000 hate crimes in a year overall. So you can say within a time frame of half of a decade, you might have, 3,500 incidents. And of those, again, not all of the 500 within this time frame, but of those, let's say 450 turned out to be proven fakes. That's actually pretty significant. So that was the first book. And again, of the higher profile cases, we recently saw Cori Bush posting some alleged death threats to Twitter, and people were pointing out, it looks like you or a staffer typed this material into a submission form and didn't send it. That's not proven, but very often when you unpack these racial incidents, these gender incidents, the Rolling Stone front cover rape ring, the more dramatic among them simply turn out not to be true. And at a certain level, that's not surprising. I mean, this is like many other overhyped phenomena like young child kidnapping. What are the chances of that actually happening? What are the chances of someone breaking into a mostly black collegiate dorm in a left-leaning college and doing thing X? So that was the first book. And the second book, Taboo, very briefly expands on this, where I look at a lot of the major claims of the hard left, which is the focus, but also the alt-right. And I just ask, is this true? So are there a large number of black men killed annually by police? I think I and Heather McDonald were the first people to look at this empirically. No, the number of unarmed brothers killed last year by cops was 18. The reason we think this is an epidemic is that every media outlet out there does, quote unquote, say their names over and over and over and over again. But the fact that there are 100 stories run on George Floyd in the period of a month doesn't mean there are 100 George Floyds. So that was chapter 1. Chapter 2 looks at interracial crime, which is extremely rare, especially white on black. Systemic racism, cultural appropriation, all these sort of dubious ideas are unpacked in the book, as well as I said, some of the right-wing ones, diverse societies don't function well, and so on. One note there, by far the most violent societies, Somalia, Bosnia, and so on, are one-race societies where people fight along tribal lines. Like, that's not even disputed in political science. Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, virtually throughout the line, Congo. But the book makes all of these points, and again, the goal there was empirically testing what people say, but what often might not be true.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, just going back to your background, I feel like your diverse background of different jobs. One of the biggest critiques of people in academia is like, you just stayed in the academic world. You've never actually been out in the world. I think that's true for a lot of people. They're essentially book smart, but they've never been on, the trading floor. They've never been, in those tough neighborhoods talking to people and stuff like that. That probably that's part of why you're a little bit unusual in your field, right?
I think so. I mean, I think that when you look at most people that have something innovative to say, I'll actually begin on a different track. One of the issues in the media and academia today is that virtually everyone's the same. And they remind me, I used to half jokingly say they remind me of the people my friends used to rob, but there's a very specific demographic that I'm thinking of. They remind me of people who were either rivals or friends or whatever, but from a wealthy city called Naperville that's not far from Chicago and Aurora where I lived. It's a specific place. It's pleasant enough. I've had some girlfriends from there and so on, some buddies from there. But it is, how would I describe it? Lower upper class, almost entirely white, coastal or Great Lakes, fairly big city vibe, 400,000 or 500,000 people. That's kind of the minimum size of an area where our elite come from. So on down the line, there's a very specific group of people that fit that demographic of coastal, big city, mostly Caucasian, liberal, low upper class, that populate a lot of these institutions. And there are a lot of shared ideas among that group, like a sort of gauzy background liberalism is definitely one of these. Just like you'd find a lot of shared ideas among military men or farmers.
Yeah.
And it's naive to think that this doesn't absolutely permeate the debate. Pew in 2004 did a survey of the national print and broadcast journalists in the USA. And what they found was that 93% of them identified either as leftists, as liberals, or as mostly left-leaning moderates when you got into deeper questions about abortion and so on. Yeah. 7% of them were conservatives, right of center, libertarians, anything of that kind. Now, in the USA overall, if you're just looking at a liberal-conservative split, probably 55% of people are conservatives in that kind of trad dad sense. So you have an underrepresentation of one group dramatically and an overrepresentation of another by hundreds of percentage points. And that definitely, I think, shapes the attitudes you see. A guy I often argue with, actually, because he comes at some of these social questions from almost an IQ hereditarian perspective, but Bo Wingard, interesting dude. But he on social media today said something that I just openly agreed with, which was, how do you think the majority of liberal or centrist regular parents and such would treat the social sciences if 93% of us were hard right? And so instead of Marxism, people were arguing for the most popular positions on the equivalent point of the spectrum, which would be like NRX, monarchism, and you know, the Groyper movement, America First. Like, it would be at the extreme of the right. And the obvious point is, well, Bo, this would be broadly dismissed as some kind of Nazi conspiracy theory. And that is how I think a lot of people in the heartland, quote unquote, feel about what's produced by a 93% liberal media, or by the way, a 92% social scientific community, something like that. And definitely, I think, like, I'm not that conservative myself on a lot of, like, being Black conservative to some extent means you apply a business attitude to the Black community and ask questions like, why wouldn't studying work for us as it does for our Caucasian friendly rivals? But I don't have a very conservative perspective at all on marijuana or sexuality or something like that. But nonetheless, I would be far to the right in academia. And I think that is, getting to the point, that is a result of having that diverse background, having had those experiences. And the more people you can get into the ivory tower from the military, agriculture, athletics, high school teaching, other things where people have had these real experiences, the better served I think the academy would be.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why I started. I really kind of bombarded Heterodox Academy until they would let me in and focus on high school, because Heterodox Academy was established to address exactly what you're talking about in higher education, but there's nothing for K through 12 until recently, because I really pushed for that. It's the same thing. I think school teachers, you're probably less so. It's more geographic. I'm sure in like Texas and Oklahoma, there's a lot of conservative K through 12 teachers, but I'm in Los Angeles, and a lot of the colleges of education are along that same breakdown that you described. I want to ask you a question about your book. So I haven't read Taboo yet, but I will. I'm gonna put it on my Audible right after I get off this call. So the subtitle
one book sold.
Huh?
I said, boom, one book sold.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. Well, hopefully more than that, because I mean, and just because this is, well, I'll get to like the big picture of your book, but the title worries me. The subtitle. I wrote that. It's how the left is selling the fake hate race war.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm worried about that is your book, and you even go into in the book the white anti-BLM people that like burn their house down, like risk their families life, carve something into their face, threw acid on their face, like white people saying like a minority did this, and I worry that this. But most of it is about the craziness of like the woke kind of pushing these narratives and stuff. But I worry that because it's like going after like the left, it's like very like Charlie Kirkish, like very like right, that the people who should be reading it won't. And that's my concern. It's the book is so important for this specific demographic to consume and wrestle with. And I worry that they'll judge a book by its cover.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, the cover of that book literally has like a burning cross on it or whatever. Now, obviously, I'm condemning that. But this is a problem actually in general, and it's a tough problem to know how to solve. So first of all, the reason the book has that subtitle is that you get paid money to write books, and that book came out with Regnery, which is a well-known conservative press. And I will say they were perfectly honorable, and I actually negotiated them away from another title. But they're definitely going to have something that's red meat for that conservative audience. And then as the author, you are going to be responsible, and you generally edit your own words. You work with a publisher at the level of Regnery. You work with a trained professional editor. So there's nothing like that inside the book. But they're definitely going to have their sales pitch on the front of it. And this, by the way, is not unique to hard nonfiction writers. I mean, a female friend of mine that we dated briefly wrote sort of feminist science fiction. And one of her comments was like, every time I write, like the cover story or the front page is like the female character like in the doggy style position wearing like a chain metal bikini, like holding a sword. Like what? That's not what's in the book. But it's like, well, the readers of science fiction are mostly 17 to 30-year-old males. Like, you know, you're gonna market to your readership. So I recognize that. I mean, the front cover of Taboo is a bondage mask because that's a nonpartisan book. But the idea is it's going to be young, edgy, mostly intellectual, dark web people that are going to buy that book, and they probably know what a bondage mask looks like. So let's get these images offline and let's put that in this sort of shocking format that'll appeal in bookstores. And that book became a bestseller. So again, the shorthand is, you know, the author is generally not responsible for that. It's in the author's contract that you'll accept reasonable publication decisions. I'm not just trying to pass the ball behind my back to Regnery. I guess I am, but it's fairly legitimate in that this would be an issue for most publications. A few established authors, like Tom Sowell, as I understand, negotiates a lot of the elements of his own books. And so when you see a Thomas Sowell book, the title is going to be something like Debt and Discrimination, just as neutral as possible. And the cover is going to be like a white square on a black square. So, I mean, hopefully I'll get to that level in a couple books. But in the meantime, I don't think those covers have hurt sales or have hurt visibility.
Probably not. Yeah, it probably helps sales. I mean, I think it does feed into that element of that tribal divisive nature where, you know, what you're laying out here is really important. And you know, I told you, I don't think we were recording it, but like I've shared this, like what I learned from your book with several friends now, and they just can't believe it. They don't believe it. And you break down all of these different cases in detail and what happened. It's like, wow, this is nuts, and it's happening all the time. And the statistics of how often it happens and stuff like that. Like, why is it? This is more of like a psychology question, I suppose. And I think I could probably wrestle with the ideas, but I'm curious what you think. Like, why is it that they don't want to hear it? Is it the psychological backfire effect? Is it that their identity is so aligned with being, you know, like against hate crimes, and hate crimes are real, and racism is the most important pressing issue that we have in the world and in America right now, that if you challenge that, then it's like challenging them, like who they are as a human being, and they get very defensive. I'm guessing that it's an element of that, but the willful ignorance, I don't want to see it. They're covering your ears, covering your eyes of like, here's some truth, here's some data and stories too about what is happening, and they just don't want to consume it. They don't want to believe it, and then they don't want to challenge their beliefs. That's my take. What do you think? Is it?
Well, I think that there are a lot of things that come into play there. So I don't think it's so much in our political climate that people feel they can't believe what the other side says. It's that to some extent they feel everyone is lying, so they don't. Charles Murray, who again is substantially to the right of me, and who I'm actually reviewing in terms of some of the IQ claims in his latest book, Facing Reality, and so on. But I mean, his comment was the portions of the book, they're just fairly accurate. Like there are 2 point whatever times as many cops in black neighborhoods as white neighborhoods because there's a higher crime rate. And there is. The African-American crime rate is, before you adjust for age and so on, 2.25 times the white crime rate, if I recall that correctly. But I mean, his comment was these things don't have anything to do with racism. The police that are patrolling these urban black neighborhoods are often black, If they're not, they're sort of anti-racist Irish or Italian city kids, Latino guys. They're no Klansmen on the Philadelphia police force. So this is simply a fact. And he goes on to say, the people that I'm most concerned about reaching this with this information are actually middle-class white liberals, i.e. people on the right already either know this or just sort of assume it. But there are many people on the left that honestly say, well, oh, you know, Murray says that, I don't believe it. Or Tom Sowell says that, I don't believe it. This happens on the right too, of course. You know, they're obviously accurate things. Rachel Maddow, for example, has said, or Tim Weiss, about corporate corruption that are not going to be believed. So I don't think it's necessarily the issue of people feel that they could never accept such facts. They simply feel the people presenting the facts are lying. And that's why Murray is saying in this book, I'm going through just chart table after table, saying, no, this is the data. I actually have some issues with his data. I mean, he estimates the black crime rate at a lot higher than what I just did, using information from a few selected cities, including like Baltimore. But I mean, anyway, the basic point there, I think, is pretty valid and fairly important. I think very often people just don't believe you. And that's why it's important to be so empirical. Like a lot of my books, the center of Taboo, frankly, verges on being boring, because I'm looking at the idea of systemic racism and I say, well, systemic racism wouldn't be a system that produces different outcomes for different groups. Because I mean, to give a simple non-controversial fact, the average age for a black man is 27, or the most common age. The most common age for a white man is 58. If the difference at the mean is even half of that, there's no way you would expect those two groups to have, for example, the same amount of wealth. This is something that's never mentioned. So that wouldn't be indicative of systemic prejudice. What would indicate systemic prejudice is two individuals that were identical across the basic metrics, like let's say age, region, test scores, family structure, like do you have a supportive wife? If those two guys were treated more than, say, 5% differently, whatever the cutoff for statistical significance would be, you would have found something really significant and really troubling. So I conduct these calculations that then I write them out in verbal form and I ask, is that the case? And it turns out it's not. Like, if you do these basic adjustments, the most successful groups in the USA are all non-white. Number one, even before the adjustment, is Indian Americans at about $135,000 per year. Then you go through Taiwanese Americans, Filipinos, I'd throw Jews in there. There's usually one mostly black group, South Africans or Nigerians.
Nigerians, yeah.
Yeah, so there's no argument for the systemic racism claim at all when you do this basic math. So I do the basic math in detail, and I find it harder for people to say that numerical equations are lies. But why would they even bother to try? I mean, I think the short answer is, if what I'm saying is real, or what Thomas Sowell is saying is real, or something like that, or any of the black scholars and business people on the board of, say, 1776 Unites, that would mean that a lot of the things that people do to be woke allies, especially on the white side, are actually actively harmful. If the reason that there are more police in the hood is that there's a high rate of crime, and having lived in the hood, I can testify that there is across all races. You know, there wasn't a shortage of crime in like 1990s Little Italy or East Aurora either. I mean, that's not a thing that you had trouble finding. But I mean, like, if that's the case, then, for example, defunding the police would be the worst possible solution to urban problems. So I think people are reluctant to think, maybe I've just been making the problem worse. When you ask just the most basic sort of conservative questions, because I feel like the left is a little more siloed than the right. Like, I mean, my partner would describe herself as a feminist. Like, it's very hard to exist in an entirely conservative world unless you're an evangelical Christian. On the other hand, I think there are plenty of almost entirely sort of whimsical left silos, like every university campus, many high school campuses. So when you present just the most baseline stuff, like, why are all these abortion clinics in black neighborhoods? People have a lot of difficulty answering that in any sort of honorable way. And I think there's a natural tendency to avoid those questions.
Yeah, I don't understand, Professor, like, you're in the world of higher education and the university world, why are you not, like, I get why citizens, just like regular everyday citizens, are like, you know, the idea of like my truth and stories and the power of stories over data, because as John Haidt said, something along the lines of like the human brain is a story processor, not a logic processor, or something like that. But when you're in social science at the highest level with a terminal degree running, in a department on a university campus, why are you falling into that same trap? Is it just because it's human nature? I mean, aren't you curious? I am not at your level when it comes to like, intellectual achievements and stuff like that. But I have a genuine curiosity of like, I just want to know what's true. And as much as that might disrupt my narrative, I don't want a false narrative. Like, what? I don't understand why that's complex for people to really struggle with it. It's what I use my social media for a lot. It's like asking kinds of questions. Like, I'm kind of a la carte when it comes to my political beliefs. Like, I'll take some conservative, I'll take some really progressive ones. Like, I'm like probably for like legalizing all drugs and stuff like that. That's pretty progressive. But also family values. And why is it that professors in social science are falling into the same trap as so many just average citizens of Starbucks? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think that there are a lot of parts to that answer. One of the most basic is kind of gets into something that a lot of people that are even junior academics starting to write have trouble grasping, which is that there's no one the science, quote unquote.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that academics are all over the place when it comes to some of this stuff, although that's slanted by, again, this 93% radial where most of them are over here. I mean, that obviously affects the conversations you can have. But I think there are two common reactions from academics who, again, are in that 90 to 95% left block. We're not talking about like the few outliers that are saying some of this stuff. But one response is sort of like, well, everybody knows that stuff already, and I don't see what use it is to talk about it. That's extremely common. So, like, one of the things that I talk about in Taboo that really predicts performance in life is test scoring. Like your performance on the boards we use to measure intelligence correlates between 0.2 and 0.4 with how you're going to do in life. And there are substantial differences between every imaginable group on these things. I will note the north-south gap is nearly as big as the black-white gap, or at least was until recently, which is one of the reasons I don't, as I've said, think there are large genetic, like black-white Asian differences. I think that verges on racism. And that's kind of the subtext under a lot of what people on the right sometimes are saying about this. I don't think that at all.
I agree with you. I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, and there actually are empirical reasons for this. Like the IQ for everyone in the world has risen about 18 points over the past 80 years. It's known as the Flynn effect. They've had to renorm the test like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, I've heard you break it down. Like it has to do with like books in the home, how old the mom was when she had the kid. Like you
all this wonky, yeah.
You level all that out, then the gap almost disappears.
Yeah, almost. I mean, like it's like the gap in marathon running. I had a debate about this online, and it was with like actually one of the guys in the debate was Kenyan, and he was like, "Look, I do think we are better runners. The Kenyan record is 2:01 or something." And we actually looked up the white record, and it was 2:04:58. The Asian record was like 2:05:12 or something.
So the Samoan record, though, it's probably like
so it's a complicated debate. Like, so first of all, I think like in the few situations where you can find identifiable, probably genetic gaps between races, they're there, but they're pretty small. Yeah. So like the 2:02 versus 2:04 versus 2:05, let's say, like that's a gap, but that's over a 26-mile race. Yeah. So similar things, if there were any similar mental, sexual, artistic, what-on gaps, you'd see those at the level of like who becomes an astronaut. I don't think that with everything fully equalized, this would be a massive problem in society. So I guess that's one of many points about this. The most significant to me is the fact that IQs regularly change for large groups over time. So the IQ for Irish Americans or Italian Americans or Polish Americans, without going too deeply into the side topic, but has increased more than 20 points, I think it's fair to say, before the Flynn effect renorming of the test. So maybe 30, 35 overall within about 100 years. Like there's no genetic way that happened. Like Irishmen who still identify as Irishmen today, much less a smaller group like Polish Jews, didn't, for some genetic reason, gain 30 points in intelligence. They started eating better. They started studying for tests. They moved into the middle class. I would predict that the same thing will happen. Black people have only had civil rights since 1954. So, I mean, like, I certainly think we could work a little bit harder, but I think you'll see that progression into full normalcy over, the next reasonable period of time. It took the poor whites 100 years. But anyway, that was just a sideline into me saying, I don't think that this is primarily, if at all, genetic, but one of the things that obviously predicts success in life is your score on these mental tests and how you do in school. And to some extent, it doesn't even matter whether this is caused by the effects of past racism on culture, which someone like Rod Graham, an opponent on the other side, would probably argue. It almost doesn't matter. Yeah, I like Rod. But it almost doesn't matter whether there's some small genetic component. What matters is like the score directly predicts how successful you're going to be. And whenever I bring that up with a left-wing friend, the first response is, everybody knows that. And then it's just silent. Like, you brought up a rude thing. It's like belching in public. Like, we don't want to talk about that. It's a lot easier to say that what makes you successful is true grit. So, I mean, most of my female PhD holding friends are intensely proud of the fact that they got 1350 GRE scores and they got the highest degree in a male-dominated field. So if you actually started challenging their accomplishment, they would get furious with you. But this is not polite to talk about. Like, over a dinner party, they would say something like, well, of course, all kids can do things that mean just as much as me working for NASA. That's approach one. Approach two is just, I think, openly unscientific. Peter Boghossian, a good casual friend of mine, would refer to this as idea laundering. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of academia, if you go to like a Marxist Sociological Association conference, which is like big, it's like top 5 or 10 if you're in that field, you're not really going to be talking about science. They're going to be panels with names like My Vagina and the Dialectic. So like, what would those people say? Well, they would just say, it sounds to me like you're using your master's tools to try to tear down your master's house. We're not going to debate unless you change the words in your paper to the proper feminist pro-vaginal etymology. Like, I've gotten reviews like this, and it's just like, okay, you guys are just on bullshit. This is just theology. But that's response two. Like, your science doesn't match my theology.
Yeah, I mean, Peter's another one I actually had on the show, and that stuff is, I've gone into that whole world a lot because I talk openly about this stuff. It's not popular. But yeah, when you talk about genetics, I mean, like people in the NFL, like if you have to be a certain size, like I'm sorry, but you just do. Like that plays in an element, but then some people just have a lot of that grit too. But keeping high standards is a requirement, and that's getting challenged right now, especially for like POC or BIPOC community is like lowering the standards, and that's just. And I've taught in schools that were 0% white, and it's like, who do you think these kids are? You think they can't hang? Like they can hang. They if you give them challenges, they can do it. You have to guide them. They just don't know how. That's my effing job is to teach you how to jump over those hurdles. But they can do it. I know that they can because I've seen it.
Yes. Just very quickly, like the only question in the scenario you're just describing is if there's a 5% gap between the black school and the white school at the end. Like I think in Illinois, when there was the same curriculum across schools, it was like 6.2%. Is any component of that due to past racism, genetics, any of these things that are being debated? I mean, I view it as a little offensive at both extremes, but that's a legitimate question. Let's address it. But the reality, the most important reality, is that you can get everyone to 90+% the same pattern of performance by making them do shit. The way that I phrase this as someone who's taught and coached is if I ran a charter school for young men, there wouldn't be any problem at all getting every single kid in the building over a 1050 SAT in like 6.5 minute mile. Like there's no healthy young male that can't do that. So why isn't the focus, and of course there are people with heart conditions and so on, but the question would be, very small number. Everyone else is out there on the track. The question is, why isn't that the focus? And I do think that for a lot of these SJW liberals that insist on discussing racism for an hour before sending the kids out to the track, metaphorically and really, or for a lot of these people on the right that'll just cite a page from, say, Arthur Jensen and say, nope, can't be done. There's essentially an element of racism that's guiding those decisions. And I view this as more troubling on the left. Like you can argue with an open bigot. Like I've bet people money. Like I bet I could get people to this level, whether it's white athletes or it's, like, are black men from KSU going to go to law school? That's not something that one I wouldn't financially bet on. But yeah, like, you can just give the numbers to someone and they will be surprised and impressed. Like, an actual bigot can in general be confronted with the high performance of his rival group and will move on. The sort of left subtle stuff, this is like Malcolm X warning about quote unquote the white liberal, I think is a lot more troubling. Like, I think the motivation for wanting to take all grades out of K through 12 schools in the larger cities, although that's years away, but all test scores away from, say, the Cal and Cal State systems. The idea is, yes, minority kids can't perform. But if that's never openly said and the entire system changes and there's no way to keep track of how the minority kids are doing, that can never be proven wrong or right, really. Wow. You're just going to have generation after generation after generation of kids being taught this dumbed down curriculum. Yeah. One of the most creepy things I've read recently, when I mentioned the Flynn effect and IQ, it seems to be reversing. And there are some, I guess, fairly weak genetic arguments you could make for this, but the most obvious reason seems to be that we're teaching a great deal of nonsense in school in the West. Like, we're teaching math that encourages you to round up to 10. Like, we're just doing stuff that if you actually take an IQ test is so simplistic, it will mark you as dumber than your father. I mean, that's really what's going on. So I think if you want, the real problem, because right now, like, urban white kids are getting screwed too. The real problem would be if you have this curriculum for the Black and Spanish kids, Hispanic kids, and then you have a different curriculum for the white and Jewish kids and Asian kids, so on down the line. That's how you get a two-tiered system. And I think there are a lot of bigots on both left and hard right that would be very glad to look at the results of that 20 years down the road and say, see, we told you. And the reality is that what would have happened there is you would have moved from the starting, say, 6% gap to a 40% gap, and then you could then say, well, black people do 40% worse. Whether or not there are some tiny differences across groups, everyone responds pretty well to the same training, and the same training should be provided in every school. And that's why charters are kicking public's asses right now. I mean, like, the 95% Black and Hispanic student population in charters is a couple points ahead every year of the majority white student population in publics. Again, there's no racism-based explanation for that. There's no genetic explanation for that. It's just, if you go to school and you work, you'll learn how to read.
Yeah, and that's a huge one. I mean, Ian Rowe, who I've talked to quite a bit, focuses on literacy rates a lot, and like how and that's across racial lines too. But there's a lot of schools that the literacy rates are appalling, and we should be focusing on that, but we're not. We're focusing on a lot of like teaching as activism, which is what I'm up against personally in my field, because I'm in a situation where I can speak out against it. Most teachers can't; they'll get fired, and they believe that they'll get fired, and they've kind of shown that. I have two more questions for you though. Okay. One is, like, you talk about organizations like Southern Poverty Law Center, maybe even like the Anti-Defamation League to some degree and stuff like that. But so they are kind of moving. There's my perspective, and please correct me if I'm off, or try and clear up my thinking on this, if you could. So I'm thinking that they were really important organizations during the Civil Rights Movement, and then they kind of moved the goalposts a bit to stay like relevant. Like, I think about it like if there was a Save the Pandas Foundation, and someone went out and they were in a helicopter taking panda numbers. They come back, they go, you know what? Panda numbers are actually thriving right now. Like, wait a second, we have 30 employees at the Save the Panda Foundation. We got pandas back from near extinction. Now they're thriving. Are we done, or do we just say, hey, let's transition this into something new? Because Southern Poverty Law Center got sued by Majid Nawaz, I believe was his name, and he was a former Islamist who got sued for like hate speech against Muslims, and he's Muslim, and he sued and won a whole bunch of money. Is there an element of that in your view? Like, these organizations that were really fundamental to getting civil rights have kind of moved the political football to some degree to stay relevant?
Hopefully the language doesn't offend, and the language originally came from the female participant in this conversation. But I was talking about the increase in rapes recently, like an increase in reported rape. And I said, that's troubling. And a female academic who was in the conversation said, well, rape now includes things like fingering at parties. And she broke it down. She was like, well, it's any contact with like the vagina or anus that's not consensual. And if you've had 3 drinks, you can't consent. So you have to understand a lot of this state-by-state data. I or she might be exaggerating slightly, but would include like that, like what I just described. if something like a dorm counselor is involved the day after. So that is how you get an increase in crime. And we've seen some of this in Sweden as well. Like migration plays a role, but so does just changing the law. So if you redefine rape to include sex while you're drunk, I mean, it's an ugly topic, but you're going to have more rapes. And it's the same thing with all of this stuff. I mean, I think it would be hard for anyone with eyes not to notice that the definitions of a lot of things like racism have been shifted around dramatically in the really recent past. So racism has generally meant, like, let's say 2 parts: believing in the biological inferiority of another group of people. Whites are weak and soft, blacks are stupid, Asians are sexually terrible, this sort of thing. These are stereotypes, not reality. But, and this goes along almost automatically, disliking. That's racism. You believe a group is inferior and so you dislike them. We've now seen this definition changed by prominent scholars like Ibram Kendi.
Privilege plus power.
Yeah, well, it was originally like it's prejudice plus power. Now the idea from Kendi seems to be any system that produces uneven results across racial groups is racist. But the problem is that that's every system. Like the NBA draft every year drafts almost exclusively Black and Slavic males, you know, over 6'6". I mean, it's a very narrow group of individuals. There are, I believe, 1 apiece Hispanic and Asian players in the league currently. So anything could be accused of racial prejudice. The tax system would be prejudiced against Asian American or Jewish American individuals because they make more money and so are specifically targeted by higher brackets. And who's to say that wasn't intentionally an effort in the beginning to take the money of, you know, the damned Germans and the Jewish community? I mean, like, anyone could make these arguments. So if you expand the definition of racism from A, that I just outlined, to B, that I just outlined, obviously you'll have far more incidences of racism in day-to-day life. This is the same thing with microaggressions, for example, where now if you're reporting to a campus body about a racial incident, you're not necessarily limited to hate crimes in the traditional sense or something like that. You can report on incidents of being microaggressed against. So after a long lull, probably beginning in the 60s, going to 2010, racism declining, you're now seeing racism surge back up, quote unquote. So yeah, I think this is obviously happening.
Consciously? Is it a conscious choice to move it? Or is it just like, is it prevalence-induced concept change? Where it's like, well, like you just get kind of like, my classroom is at 74 degrees. My students like, it's so hot in here. I'm like, guys, like 20 years ago, you didn't have air conditioning. Like, no, but just you've just gotten used to it. Is it that?
Well, it's a mix. I think that humans are a predator species. So I think that to some extent, a great deal of our action is rationalization of things we want to do. Money making, I mean, sexual affairs are very common, violence. So there can generally be justifications given for this. He didn't love me anyway, but they're not really moral in the actual sense of that term. And I think a fair amount of that has to be going on here logically. I would say that the causal mechanism probably is that there are a great many organizations that you just mentioned, the SPLC, the ACLU, so on down the line, that have multi-million or billion-dollar budgets. Southern Poverty Law Center has a well-invested endowment of $470 million. And these organizations receive funding and have power insofar as they fight real threats like white supremacy. White supremacy in the traditional sense, let's say membership in the Ku Klux Klan as a proxy, or the John Birch Society, White Citizens Council, any of the traditional proxies, has declined to virtually nothing, maybe 5,000 people nationally. So do you disband the organization? Does everyone go get a job, you know, working on crab boats or teaching in tough slum schools? No. You probably hold a seminar on the new racial issues of today, and you shift the focus to whatever it might be, the Proud Boys or
almost like a business, right, Professor? Like it'd be like a business, like, hey, like Kodak's, like, hey, maybe we should go digital. Seems like everyone's going digital. Like we got to stay alive.
But the difference is that when you redefine an actual business product, you're producing a better generation of something for people to consume. When you redefine an idea like racism, what you're doing is making a moral decision that people need to keep a fight going even after the original threat has been removed. I've often said the most dangerous time for a movement is after it wins a preliminary round, so on. For example, I worked for the Human Rights Campaign. Still proud of this. No problem with the gay community. But I mean, we were campaigning on a gay marriage bill, and we won. I mean, it went through the Supreme Court. Wasn't through the state houses. But gay marriage is now fully legal. You can get married if you're gay. So to some extent, I mean, that organization seems like it could pull back about 45% of the fundraising that it was doing. Is it going to? No. You're going to look for a new campaign. And I think, by the way, that's why the trans issue has become so prominent. The transgender community, we're always sort of the little brothers in the LGBT movement. Obviously, this is a real mental health condition. No one thinks it's weird or something in adult life. But this wasn't what you led with, having worked in at least a field manager role at that organization and so on. Now, I mean, the only group that can argue that they are denied substantial civil rights in the USA, arguably, is trans people. So the claim has become, you're now seeing this entire movement, sex is a spectrum, the term male is a slur. And a lot of this scientifically is kind of nonsensical. I don't think people are going to go along with it. But at very least, there are a lot of guilty liberals out there, and you can ensure yourself a fundraising profile for the next 30 years. So it's important to keep that in mind. Like, do they really believe this? I don't know. Un caballero poderoso es el don dinero. Money is a powerful gentleman. I assume you probably speak Spanish, but I don't think all the audience does. But I mean, it's just like, if you can easily be convinced by Patron, the boss man, that you want to do something because it gives you a hat full of silver pieces. Like, did you really know beforehand that coyotes were a plague on the sheep? You know now. Yeah. And that's actually a real example. We started paying bounties for coyote pelts in Mexico and the USA, basically just because, rich people and the game authority killed all the wolves, and you weren't going to get rid of all the sharpshooters and, the plans you had in place for farms and all this. So you just moved on to something else. And I think that's what we're seeing now. The activist groups are moving on to something else. What is the coyote to the wolf of the clan?
That makes sense. And I think the tool that they use, you actually use as well, which is stories. The my truth versus objective truth thing. Like Thomas Sowell, is a lot of data and stuff, but typically the data people they're not great at telling stories that like are heart-wrenching. But you do that well. You do that really well. And you broke down some of these stories that were frustrating because like the hoaxers were bad, the bad guys essentially. But then also you broke down some of those stories that were like black on white crime and like people being tortured. I think you said one about like feeding people to alligators and stuff, like really horrible stuff. Why is Fox News, which is very divisive, and they're trying to like, I don't know about start a race war, but they're not backing down, let's say. Why don't they play a lot of tit for tat stuff? It's a lot of that. A lot of like the conservatives, it seems like now, are like the pushing back on woke. They're the anti-woke. So whatever the crazy woke people do, which is crazy on the fringe, then the conservatives, even mainstream conservatives, go, look at the crazy fringe, look what they're doing. Why don't they tell those stories? I didn't hear most of those stories on Fox News, but in general, the stories are so important. And you say you've written about how like the front page hate crime, but then the retraction is on page like 26. But it's already planted the seed. A lot of people know things. They know things based on these stories, but they're not connected to any kind of data or any kind of even what's the word, like verification of is it true or not. But the stories guide people in their perception of the world so much. So I just think that we need to tell better stories to get us closer to the truth, because stories they're excellent for getting us to the truth, but they could also be used they're excellent for getting us away from the truth. And far too often I'm seeing the stories breaching from what is actually reality. But what you're doing, and I think is so important, it's nice to see, is you're taking stories that are bringing you closer to the truth. What are your thoughts on that kind of thing?
Well, I think there are two comments there. It's a good question. The first, I agree, and I did that to some extent intentionally in the book. So one of the things I say about interracial crime, and I'm actually going to give some data here and then go into the stories, but I note in chapter 2 of this book and in a whole chapter in Taboo that interracial crime is not a particularly big deal in the USA. This is just empirically factual. The groups in the USA, whether you're talking about Southern whites, urban blacks, are tough, for want of a better word. People rarely, except for the crime of robbery, go into the other man's neighborhood and risk death to commit an act of random violence against a stranger. The person most likely to kill you for males is generally your ex-wife. So, I mean, it's not a huge issue. Like, to put this in specific terms, In 2018, which is the most recent year, I believe, on record, there were about 600,000 violent interracial crimes involving Black and white people. So either a Black perp and a white victim, or a white perp and a Black victim. That sounds like a lot, but there were 20 million crimes. And that's just violent and very serious property crimes like carjacking, burglary. These are what are called index crimes. Now, you could break it down more. Like if you just went into violent crimes and you added up all interracial crimes combined, you might get over 10%. But Black-white interracial crime was 3% of crime. This is not a massive problem. And I say that very openly. But then I say that what's remarkable about the media discussion of this is that when you look at the Barbecue Becky, Pool Patrol Paula, Central Park bird watching, more seriously Dylan Roof, when you look at these debates, George Floyd, almost all you're seeing is white on Black crime. So I wanted to look at the data and see if that's the way it cut. And I had my suspicions, having lived in a city, but it's
5-1, right?
Yeah, it's 80% Black on white. Like there's not of this tiny section of crime, robberies of the other race and so on, wealthy women of one group being attacked by the other, so on. Of those incidents, 80% of them were Black on white. Now, I will note the actual math is much more complicated than this, but just as a baseline explanation of why that's not as horrible as it sounds, there are 5 times as many white people. Now, again, that would just lead you'd actually predict about the same number of crimes in either direction, given that number. But that's still a starting point for analysis of this. Black people are much younger, white people have more money. So you're not seeing a race war on either end, as the quote unquote alt-right will sometimes try to persuade you, but you are seeing 5-1 Black on white crime, and you're not seeing that discussed in the media anywhere. So I said this, and then I said, if we're going to talk about this, which I don't think we should because it's 3% of crime, but if we are going to talk about this, forgive me, bullshit issue, let's tell some of the stories on the other side. And I just did a 30-minute dive into local media. And one of the stories I found was about a girl who was kidnapped, made into a sex slave, and fed to alligators. So the whole story is pretty horrific. You can find it in the book. But essentially a spring breaker, Brittany Drexel, I believe underage, she was like partying with the older girls in her family, was like taken out of a bar by a random guy who happened to be Black. Now this part could as easily have been a white, Hispanic, whatever guy. But she was apparently drugged, taken to a house. She was kept there, sexually abused for several days. When she tried to run away, one of the people, who was apparently some kind of local gangbanger, got mad, shot her. And to get rid of the body, they threw the body into an alligator pond. So the body was apparently eaten by alligators. And my point was like, this doesn't make Rodney King or George Floyd or any less horrible, but it's very easy to do this in all directions. Now, are we going to put up the 3% of crime and work on the schools, or no? And I think that's an important point to make. Because the other side could as easily do this. I mean, and there are niche websites that do this that will.
Yeah, but why doesn't the mainstream? Why doesn't Fox?
I think that one reason is that Fox isn't really all that right wing, except for Tucker Carlson. Well, Tucker Carlson's not all that right wing. Tucker Carlson just doesn't care. He's independently wealthy. I like Tucker Carlson, but I mean, like for most of maybe Hannity would. Yeah. But I think that one of the things a lot of people don't notice about the mainstream media, like there's this bugaboo that Fox is an extraordinarily right wing network. That's not really accurate. Like I read James O'Keefe's book, which I bought at Freedom Press, which is a libertarian event. And he's done some wacky stuff in the past. He's a very good gonzo journalist. Some of the videos are pretty real, so I got his book. And one of the things that the book is well written. It's American Pravda. But one of the things that he did in there was look at the coverage of Trump by network. And I think he probably did this originally as a businessman to see how on his side Fox was from a strategic perspective. But what he found was that Fox's coverage of Trump was 52% negative and 48% positive, at least early on. I believe this was through 2017. The reason Fox stood out is that the coverage of every other major outlet was almost 100% negative. Like the Washington Post was 83% negative. The New York Times was 87% negative. ARB Deutschland in Germany was 98% negative. CNN was 90% negative. So his comment was, it's not that Fox is a radical right-wing outlier. Fox is like the center-right business network with Chris Wallace, Neil Cavuto, Britt Hume, so on down the line. And there's a strong line in terms of what they won't touch. So like Fox hasn't played all the Veritas videos. I mean, that would be up to individual hosts like Laura Ingraham or something like that. So I think that that's why you don't see that very much. You might see that on like the Tucker Carlson website, not even the network itself, but you're not going to see Britt Hume leading with that story because they're kind of the center-right business folks network. I do think as you get into OAN and Newsmax and so on, as you start getting more of this stuff on the right, you will see stories like this. And to some extent, that would just be an intensification of the negative cycle, where the left-wing network has a BS story about, white man assaults black woman, and then the right-wing network has a BS story about black man attacks white woman. Like, they're both real stories, but they're 350 million people. But to answer your question, that's why I think Fox doesn't emphasize this too much. Their goal actually is to be the most watched center-right network. If you ever talk to executives or pundits from Fox.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that gets to what Matt Taibbi talked about in his book, Hate Inc., is like, don't forget that media and news is a consumer product. It's a business. Yes. And you're there. I mean, just like you said, kind of about the publishing companies, like, we got to sell books, we got to sell news, we got to do it. And there's good things in that, but you have to kind of work within that system of markets. And so you kind of get what you get. But you can find a lot of good stuff out there. I think we just can't forget that New York Times has, they're there to sell newspapers or whatever, subscriptions, and this is their approach. And Roger Ailes, when he created Fox, it's like, this is his approach, and it worked. So hammer that base a little bit. We did over an hour. Wilfred Reilly, thank you so much for being here. I feel like I could talk to you forever. You're so reasonable and so like and so a lot of people aren't. But and so like kind of thought out, and like you mix the kind of left and right brain stuff really well, and I can tell that in your book too. And that, I think, exactly, because I'm like the heterodox guy, I'm like left and right guy, whatever viewpoint diversity, and you seem to embody all of that, which is the only way we're going to get to what is whatever the truth is. So we have to understand both elements. So your books, Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo, are available wherever books are. I highly recommend, especially if you are, because my audience is pretty split, if you are a social justice, anti-racist person, this is going to be good. It's going to be frustrating, but this is getting you closer to how we can solve these problems. If you understand that what is actually going on, then you can actually solve the problems. That I couldn't recommend this enough, like more for that group. Conservatives, it's a great book, but for the far left people, it's a really important book. Books, I'm sure. Well, I'm gonna read Taboo, but what else? Any like parting words? Social media where people can find you, keep up with what you're doing, and things like that.
Yeah, I'm extremely easy to find. I'm very online. My social media. So my name is Wilfred Reilly. It's WILFRED REILLY. I mean, my Twitter's under that name. I have the catchy handle Wildebeest, which I used to use jokingly playing basketball and so on, but it's my name. Facebook's my name. Website's my name. So if you Google my name, you'll find me and all of my books. And I strongly encourage you to do so. And I strongly encourage you to go out and look for content across left, right, scientific center in general. When people ask, one question I often get is, where can I find that data that you use? The white crime rate, the black crime rate, marital violence, like any of the things, SPLC's budget. The short answer is in the library or on the internet. I mean, virtually all that stuff. I mean, the first three figures are just from the Bureau of Justice Stats Crime Report, which most public buildings have. So go forth, do good, get some knowledge.
Love it. All right, cool. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, man. All right.